So I know it's been a while since I've done one of these videos, but I just got finished watching the last episode of the new series of Doctor Who, and I've got a lot of opinions on this, so I thought I'd do another one of these, so let's get into it with the first episode. The first episode of the new series, Space Babies. This was such a stupid, silly episode, but you know what? I actually kind of loved it. This does kind of feel like they were doing something to try and bring the fun and the silly and the campy elements back to Doctor Who, to try and bring back that lost audience that they got. And it may not have been the best attempt at it, but it was actually quite fun. Basically, the planet in which they came from had an extremely low population rate, so they were engineering new babies in order to bring the population up. But for whatever reason, the circumstances changed, so they weren't allowed to leave the base, and they also can't grow up because of how their genetics are done. And that's pretty much all you need to know about this episode. I'll try to avoid spoilers where I can, but for some of the later episodes it's going to be inevitable. But either way, it's a very silly episode, like I said, very childish, but like I said, it is creative, it is fun, and it does have some good moments in it, so I would admit that it may not be for everybody, but I enjoyed it. This has also made me realise that while Russell T Davies hasn't necessarily matured past his rather holier-than-thou attitude, he has at least become aware of it, because instead of having the Doctor soapbox for 5 minutes, basically directly ranting at the audience, it'll basically be one word or sentence in an episode that is a blink and you'll miss it moment, and they just won't address it again and move on. It's not ideal, I admit, and it can still be a bit annoying, and I can totally understand why people won't like it. For example, in this episode, it's basically a line that is effectively saying abortion should be legal and those who say it isn't are assholes, which, not throwing my hat into the discussion of that or anything, it is a bit of a difficult subject to get into, especially in a family show, but like I said, it was basically one line and they ignored it for the rest of the episode, so again, I kind of wish Russell T Davies wouldn't do these very socio-politically charged bits in his writing, but it's definitely better than what he used to be back in the David Tennant era. Next, The Devil's Chord, aka the one with the Beatles in it. This one I really enjoyed. Granted, the whole big draw of the episode, the fact that it takes place during the 1960s when the Beatles were recording what was initially their synonymous album, is kind of an afterthought. The Beatles are barely in it and barely do anything in the episode, and they don't really go that much into the whole element of why they were so important. They're just sort of there, which was rather disappointing. However, the villain more than makes up for it. This introduces us to a new villain, the Maestro, who is the spawn of the Celestial Toymaker and is basically the god of all music, and much like the Celestial Toymaker, they really delight in messing around with humanity and the Doctor. The performance of this character is really what makes it, and also the way in which they look as well is amazing. They look like this sort of weird cartoonified version of an old Maestro, hence the name. They kind of look like, and I know this is a really random reference, but the way Beethoven looked for that one scene in Dragon's Lair 2. Just look at that moment and just look at the Maestro and you'll see what I'm talking about. But yeah, they are a lot of fun, and the actress that plays them specifically said that she was inspired by Ursula from The Little Mermaid in her performance, and you can see that. It is a delightfully, deliciously entertaining performance, and I really buy that. And also, I noticed that Russell T Davies is doing a lot of writing with Doctor Who involving the really big celestial or divine-based villains and characters. And it's actually been working really well for him. He actually does some really good stuff with this, and this is another example. So yeah, I highly recommend this one, even if, like I said, the stuff with the Beatles is a bit disappointing, plus that song at the end was really crap. I like that they've got Murray Gold back, he's an amazing composer, but I'll admit that some of his more recent stuff isn't as good as he was back in his heyday. And even then, I actually liked the song they used in The Church on Ruby Road, for as cheesy as it was. But yeah, the one at the end of this episode is not a great song, but I can at least applaud them for trying something different with it. Next, Boom, which is the first new episode written by Stephen Moffat, who's my favourite modern Doctor Who writer. I think overall, in terms of all writers, most hardcore Doctor Who fans would say Terry Nation is the best one, and he is very good, but Moffat's a close second to me. And this was a pretty good episode, and very emblematic of his style. It's very self-contained as well. It almost all takes place within one particular location, and it never moves out of there. It's got an interesting premise as well. It's sort of got that Hitchcockian vibe of the bomb's about to go off, but we're too busy talking about something else to deal with it kind of feel about it. And it's got some really macabre concepts about it as well, which was really interesting. Though I will admit, I don't think this is one of his best works. I mean, when you look at Stephen Moffat, you can easily point at some of his best stories, The Empty Child, Blink, or some of the stuff he did during the Matt Smith era. This one's not really up to par with those, but it was still a good episode. Next, 73 Yards. Oh boy, what to say about this one. This was a very weird, esoteric episode. It kind of reminded me a lot of Turn Left, another Russell T Davies story, but with even less stuff explained. It's hard to even explain the plot of this one, but it definitely had that kind of feel about it where I wasn't sure if it's a genius story or if it's just so far up its own arse that we don't even know what's going on. It reminded me a lot of 2001: A Space Odyssey in that regard, but this one wasn't quite nearly as memorable as that movie is, and I'll admit, I think technically speaking it is a very good episode, but because it was so complicated and it was just so mysterious, it's kind of hard to enjoy it, but I would definitely recommend checking it out just to see what you think of it. Next, Dot and Bubble, and this is another one I feel very ambivalent about. So this is basically an episode that's trying to be a social satire of modern social things, but done in a futuristic environment, kind of similar to Red Dwarf or Futurama in that regard. And in this case, they're mocking the idea of social media and the sort of super plugged-in Gen Z generation, which I'm okay for that. I'm up for something like that. It seems like it's something that would be ripe for parody, and I could see Doctor Who doing it quite well. But wow, is this episode mean-spirited. It acts like it absolutely despises the Gen Z generation. And to be fair, speaking as someone who is the generation below that, I can certainly understand that when you're looking at them when you're not part of that generation, they can seem rather shallow and annoying, but man, the people who made this really don't like them. They basically make them the most scummy, shallow, and just downright stupid people you could possibly imagine. But I can't deny that in the fact that they are so mean-spirited, it actually does make it a little bit entertaining if you're just willing to let go about the idea of, wow, they really don't like Gen Z people, and just kind of see it as this incredible sort of mocking of that particular generation. It is kind of fun in a very mean-spirited kind of way. I also will say that there were parts that were actually quite clever and funny, like the idea of this world where the young people are so inept at being able to do things outside of their social media bubble, they don't even know how to fucking walk on their own. That was actually quite funny. And also the bit where the woman wakes up and the first thing she does is log into her online world. As a person who runs a Discord server, that was way, way, way too relatable for me, so that did actually kind of hit quite close to home for me. But yeah, this episode is so mean-spirited, and there's literally only one redeemable character besides the Doctor and Ruby in this episode. Just one. And he dies very unceremoniously, so yeah, there is literally no one to root for in this episode beside the main characters, who aren't in it that much either, so yeah. It's not a bad episode, but definitely one that is a bit difficult to watch. But hey, you check it out and see what you think. Next, Rogue. And this was actually surprisingly one of the highlights of the series, and I'm also surprised that it's one of the few that wasn't written by Russell T Davies. It was actually written by some new writers who are brand new to Doctor Who in general, but it felt very much like it was an old school Russell T Davies episode, and that actually surprised me, but either way, it was actually a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. It was this really clever idea of aliens wanting to masquerade as humans in order to experience like they're living like them, and even use this as a way to kind of manipulate political elements to try and destroy the world potentially. It was a really cool idea, and it also gave me some really interesting quotes like, "We will cosplay this world to death," which I'm definitely going to use that next time I go to a convention. This did also make me notice something that the BBC's been doing a lot lately, and it is a bit infuriating, where they keep deliberately putting in references to their own shows as a kind of a way to advertise them within the other shows. And I get that they are struggling recently, but I'm sorry, it's just really obvious and desperate. Not to mention, I don't think people who watch Doctor Who are going to be that interested in Bridgerton. There's not that much crossover appeal there. So either make more shows that appeal to Doctor Who fans, or stop trying to shove it down their throats to get them to watch it, because it won't work. There's also a new character introduced in the series called the Rogue, who kind of feels like this series' equivalent to Captain Jack Harkness, who... I won't go into detail about why he's not in the show anymore, because this video is going to be contentious enough as it is without going into why he's not in it anymore. But if he is meant to be filling that role, he's not bad for it. I kind of wish we would have actual Captain Jack back, but this guy's actually pretty good. He's got that same sense of charm about him, and he's really entertaining, so I do hope we get to see him more. And finally, the ending two-parter, The Legend of Ruby Sunday, and The Empire of Death. So this one, I am going to have to go into spoilers a bit because it's impossible not to, but this kind of goes into the whole who is Ruby Sunday and who is her mum thing, which links into this whole he who waits thing that's been led up throughout the whole series, and I have to admit, I think they all tied it together pretty well. There are still some unanswered questions, and the second part was a little bit messy, but yeah, I thought it was really entertaining and definitely a really good highlight for the series. So to explain who He Who Waits is, it was basically revealed that it was actually an old Doctor Who villain who, much like the Celestial Toymaker, was a one-off in the initial episode they appeared in, but has become a fan favourite, and that being Sutekh the Destroyer, aka the villain of the classic Tom Baker serial, The Pyramids of Mars. He's basically the god of death and a celestial being who was also the inspiration for Anubis in Egyptian culture, because he visited that time and of course they thought he was a god. So yeah, he's a very powerful and dangerous villain, although I will say the Doctor said that he was the most dangerous person he's ever faced. Really? I could think that there's probably more out there who are more dangerous than him. I mean, granted, he is the god of death, so it's kind of hard to beat that, but I don't know, you've actually fought the devil itself. I feel like there's probably more people out there who would probably be more powerful than this guy, but to be fair, he is pretty up there in terms of Doctor Who baddie, so I'll grant you that. So it was effectively revealed that after he was defeated in the Pyramids of Mars, he actually latched his consciousness onto the TARDIS and remained hidden all that time. So he's actually been going around with the Doctor throughout this entire time since he was Tom Baker. And since he's been doing that, he's been planting little persons on each world he's visited who we've actually been seeing throughout the series, this old woman who just kept popping up all over the place. Turns out they're actually puppets of his, and they were basically put there to spread his influence all throughout the universe when the time was right and effectively kill everything. And he actually does it. He kills everything, and basically most of the second part of the episode is the Doctor and Ruby and Mel, who also comes back. And I have to give credit, even though I didn't really like Mel when she was back in the Colin Baker era, she does a really good job in some of her revived appearances, so bravo to her. And they basically have to spend the rest of the episode trying to figure out how to reverse the fact that everyone is dead, so yeah, definitely not putting the pressure on them there. I won't go too far into details because obviously it's going to be more of a surprise if you know how he's defeated and just what exactly happens, but it was definitely a lot of fun and it had a really good emotional element to it too. There were some parts where I almost started tearing up, and that's actually quite impressive. But yeah, I can certainly understand why some people weren't a fan of this reveal, because it does feel kind of a little bit out of left field, just because it didn't feel like they had set up exactly who He Who Waits was going to be very well. But I suppose the vagueness made it more of a surprise, not that I didn't know this going in, because unfortunately it got spoilt for me a day before I watched it. But hey, that's what happens when you live on the internet. But even so, I actually really enjoyed it, and while I can certainly understand why some people won't like it, I say give it a go again and you might end up enjoying it. But yeah, it definitely was a bit of a mess in the second episode. But regardless of that, that's the entirety of the new series, and I have to say, it was pretty damn good. This is the most fun I've had watching Doctor Who in a long time. It feels like they're actually trying to make the show fun again, which the show has been shockingly devoid of for a long time. So I'm glad that they're trying to bring things back, and I have to take my hat off to Russell T Davies. He was never one of my favourite writers, especially because, like I said, he had a tendency to soapbox and feel a little bit self-important in his writing. But he has seemed to become aware of that, and he hasn't been doing it as much in this new series. And yeah, the good parts of his writing that were always there, I'd actually argue they're even better now, so bravo to him. He's definitely evolved a lot as a writer. I can understand why they brought him back as well, because he effectively was the architect in bringing Doctor Who back to the masses in 2005, and when you look at the way he actually put it all together, it was genius and it really worked well, so I can certainly understand why they brought him back instead of Stephen Moffat or bringing in someone new entirely. So yeah, I have to give him some serious credit. He did a really good job this time around. Now, I will admit, I know that the series has definitely been not very well received by certain fans, and to be honest, if you don't like it, then I can kind of understand that, and obviously not everyone's going to like everything. I can understand why you wouldn't like it. This series definitely still had its flaws, I won't deny that, but I think the good parts definitely overweigh the bad parts, and I seriously recommend that if you are a fan of Doctor Who, particularly the David Tennant era, you should check this series out. I thought it was really good. But let's see what I dematerialize into next time.